A $500 million sentence, no jury, no defense, just one black woman, alone in a courtroom built to break her. Her name is Jasmine Crockett, and in a chamber lined with silence and power, she was meant to be a cautionary tale, a headline to be buried, an example made. But then, she whispered something, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with a calm that made even the judge lean forward. In that moment, she didn't just defend herself. She exposed something the nation wasn't ready to confront. Not just a lie, but a system. And when the truth unfolded, page by page, line by line, a man who'd once written the law found himself trembling and crying. Because what she revealed wasn't just her innocence, it was our reflection. So now the question isn't what they did to her, it's what did she say that made a Supreme Court justice cry? And more importantly, what does it say about us? The fog rolled across the steps of the Alexandria Federal Courthouse like it knew something no one else did. Thick, heavy, alive. It didn't just hide the morning light, it swallowed it, draping every stone in the statue in a veil of anticipation. By 6:42 a.m., reporters were already lining the sidewalks, their breath clouding in the cold air, lenses aimed like weapons at the courthouse doors. They weren't there for facts. They were there for a fall. Inside, the halls were colder than usual, not just in temperature, but in tone. No one said it out loud, but everyone could feel it. Today wasn't about justice. Today was about a message. And the message was aimed at one woman. Representative Jasmine Crockett walked through the side entrance alone. No cameras caught her arrival, no security escort. Just a navy blue coat cinched tightly at the waist, a plain folder tucked under her arm, and a cheap gas station coffee that had long gone cold. She didn't speak to the clerk who half glanced up. She didn't nod at the guard who avoided her eyes. She just walked, calm, straight, silent, as if the air itself dared not challenge her. No one noticed the way her fingers gripped the folder just a little too tightly, or the slight twitch in her jaw when she passed the hearing room door. But what they all noticed, what froze them for a breath, was the stillness in her eyes. That kind of quiet didn't come from peace. It came from war, the kind you survive alone. The courtroom itself was already packed, not with truth seekers, but spectators, staffers, bloggers, cable crews, a few former donors pretending to look concerned. They whispered in corners, swapped rumors, watched the door. They'd heard what was coming, a $500 million fine. No trial, no defense. Just a sentence. Swift, spectacular, televised. And then the door opened. Every head turned. Jasmine entered without looking left or right. No makeup, no mask. Just conviction wrapped in silence. She walked past rows of seats filled with people who once cheered her rise. Now they sat waiting to witness her fall. The judge hadn't even entered, and the verdict already felt final. Someone in the press pit muttered, "She's done." Another replied, "She should have known better." No one asked how a congresswoman with no criminal record, a history of civil rights work, and one of the cleanest voting records on Capitol Hill had ended up here. That part didn't matter today. Not to them, but it mattered to her. Because beneath that cheap folder was a truth so sharp it could bleed. A truth so buried it took months to dig out. A truth she wasn't supposed to have. And when she opened it, someone powerful would fall. They just didn't know it yet. But she did. And that's why, while they came for spectacle, Jasmine came for something else. Not revenge. Not redemption. A reckoning. The wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of hushed judgment. A low murmur passed between rows like wind through brittle leaves. "She's finished," someone whispered near the back. "They're making an example of her," murmured another. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, as if she hadn't heard a thing. As if the courthouse weren't packed with people waiting for her to break. But her silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. She knew how quickly public applause turned to poison. She'd lived through that switch before. Years ago, long before the congressional hearings and federal scrutiny, she was just a civil rights attorney in South Dallas, scraping together case files in a windowless office above a check-cashing store. No interns. No PAC donors. Just her, a printer that jammed every third page, and a corkboard covered in the names of people no one else would defend. People deported without warning, workers unpaid for months, families evicted over clerical errors. She didn't take the easy cases, she took the invisible ones. There was the mother whose autistic son had been handcuffed at school for noncompliance. The factory worker whose spine was crushed under a collapsed platform and told he'd be handled out of court. Jasmine stood by them all, not because it was profitable, but because it was right. And in doing so, she built something no headline could capture. Credibility that didn't come from politics, it came from pain. One night, just before her first televised debate, her car sputtered to a stop 2 blocks from the studio. No gas, no time, no backup. She kicked off her heels, grabbed her notes, and ran barefoot across cracked sidewalks lit by liquor store fluorescents. Security tried to stop her at the door, but she waved her ID in the air like a torch and yelled, "I've got 30 seconds and 1 shot. Are you going to be the reason I miss it?" She made it with 12 seconds to spare, barefoot and breathless, but she won the debate in landslide polling the next morning. She still kept those busted heels under her desk, a reminder that sometimes grit beats grace. Now seated in the heart of a courtroom designed to break spirits with formality, Jasmine looked across the gallery and saw familiar faces from that same debate, some smirking, some shaking their heads. She didn't flinch. Let them whisper. Let them write the eulogy, because she hadn't come to survive this room. She'd come to rewrite it. And buried beneath the courthouse drama, beyond the cameras, beyond the scoffs and whispers, was something much more dangerous than ambition, conviction. They thought they knew who she was. They didn't know the fire she'd walked through to get here. They were staring at smoke, thinking it meant the flame had gone out. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. She was just getting ready to burn the lie down. The hinges groaned slightly as the side door opened, and in walked Malcolm Reed, federal prosecutor, media darling, career climber. His suit was perfect, navy-tailored, not a wrinkle in sight. His smile was sharper than necessary, and his stride carried the quiet arrogance of someone who thought he was about to put a trophy on his resume. Reed had been briefed. He had read the memos. This was supposed to be clean, fast, final. He didn't come for justice. He came for a scalp. He surveyed the courtroom with the ease of a man who believed the ending had already been written. The cameras followed him like obedient dogs, panning from his polished shoes to his confident eyes. He nodded once to the judge, once to the gallery, and finally, lingering a beat longer than necessary, to Jasmine Crockett. He expected to see fear, or at least fatigue, but she didn't even blink. Her posture didn't shift. Her face didn't flinch. She looked at him like someone watching a movie they'd seen before, and already knew the ending too. Reed paused just slightly, a flicker of confusion, so quick you'd miss it unless you were looking. Jasmine was. He took his place at the prosecution table, spreading his notes like he was laying out a map to victory. The judge glanced over his glasses, lips pressed tight. The clerk whispered something to a bailiff. And through it all, Jasmine remained still, observing, waiting. Then without a word, she turned her head and gave a single, deliberate nod to the woman seated beside her. Ella Hartman. The move was so subtle it could have been missed. But for Ella, it was everything, like a key in a lock that had been waiting too long. She didn't move immediately. She didn't even look up. But her fingers slowly found the edge of her briefcase and held it. There was something planted in that nod, something that cracked beneath the surface. The judge cleared his throat. "Counsel, are we ready to proceed?" Reed stood confidently. "Ready, Your Honor." Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't need to. Ella spoke instead, her voice calm and measured. "We're ready." From the outside, it looked routine, like the beginning of just another high-profile legal drama. But something had shifted, not on the surface, beneath it, like fault lines tightening before an earthquake. What the court didn't realize, what Malcolm Reed certainly didn't realize, was that this wasn't the start of her collapse. This was the opening scene of his, because Jasmine Crockett had been underestimated before, and every time someone wrote her off, they forgot the same thing. You don't bury someone who's already dug their way out once. She wasn't here to beg. She was here to flip the script, and that quiet nod, that was the first domino. She hadn't spoken for nearly 40 minutes, but when she finally did, it wasn't a statement for the record or an objection for the clerk to note. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. It was a whisper, barely above a breath, but it carried weight, enough to tilt the air. "Show them," Jasmine said softly, turning just enough for her lawyer to hear. That was all. No theatrics, no defiance. Just two words. Calm, certain, and precise. Words that moved like the pulling of a trigger in a room full of dry kindling. Ela Hartman didn't look up. She didn't ask for clarification. She already knew. Her hand reached below the desk, past the legal pads and sealed exhibits, and found the edge of a yellow folder. It was worn, frayed at the corners, slightly curled from too many hands holding it too tightly for too long. A folder that didn't belong to a high-powered legal team. It looked like something found in the bottom of a file cabinet in a forgotten office. But it carried more than paper. It carried leverage and truth. Jasmine stared ahead, still and unblinking, as Illa laid the folder gently on the table, her fingers resting on it like it was scripture. The courtroom hadn't noticed yet. Reed was still thumbing through his notes, pausing only to glance smugly toward the gallery. The judge shifted in his seat, reaching for his glasses. The clerk adjusted the microphone. Routine movements, muscle memory. But beneath the hum of normalcy, something had shifted, like the distant vibration before a building begins to shake. Illa stood, slowly, with reverence. The entire room watched her now. Something about the way she moved made people stop mid-sentence. The rustling stopped. The tapping pens stilled. Reporters glanced up. Even the court artist froze, her charcoal suspended in midair. "Your Honor," Illa began, voice steady and exacting. "Before this court proceeds any further, the defense moves to submit new evidence." Judge Thomas blinked once. "Counselor, we've already moved to judgment. The ruling was issued this morning." "Yes, Your Honor, but this," she gently tapped the folder, "is not rebuttal, it's revelation." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "On what grounds?" Illa looked him directly in the eye. "This evidence was concealed from us. Deliberately, we received it from a whistleblower inside the Department of Justice. 3 days ago." Gasps didn't erupt. They crept, as if the oxygen in the room had been replaced with static. Some people inhaled and didn't exhale. Reed froze. His pen slipped. A whisper slid through the gallery like a breeze in a graveyard. The camera lenses narrowed, focusing not on faces, but on that folder. It didn't glow. It didn't speak. But every person in that courtroom knew. That folder was going to ruin someone. And Jasmine Crockett, she hadn't even moved, because this had never been about shouting. This was about timing. And the time had come. The judge hesitated. His fingers hovered above the folder like it might burn. Illa didn't move. She knew what was inside, knew the weight it carried. Jasmine sat motionless, her eyes locked on the bench. It wasn't defiance, it was precision. She wasn't here to sway opinion. She was here to detonate expectation. With a slight nod from the judge, Illa stepped forward and laid the folder gently on the podium, like it was a final offering. She opened it with deliberate care. No theatrics, no rush, just a quiet confidence that made even the faint hum of fluorescent lights seem too loud. Page 1. A Department of Justice Internal Audit Report. Date stamped, official seal, signature of the Director of Compliance. The document was brief, but damning. It stated in bold red font, "Issue originated from third-party accounting software misclassification. No evidence of intent or fraud by Congresswoman Crockett." Judge Thomas squinted. His lips parted just slightly. He turned the page. Page 2. A string of internal emails between DOJ senior officials. The tone was not technical. It was strategic. One read, "Delay public disclosure. Optics are the concern." Another, "She's a problem politically. A fast penalty neutralizes her midterm noise." The final email simply said, "Burden her with silence. Don't give her time to recover." Silence did not burden the courtroom now. It gripped it. Reporters stopped typing. Courtroom artists dropped their charcoal. The air changed. It wasn't just still, it was alert. like the entire room had realized it had been standing on a trapdoor. Malcolm Reed stiffened. His jaw twitched. He leaned toward his own paralegal, whispering something sharp and fast. She shook her head, wide-eyed, mouthing, "We didn't have that." Judge Thomas cleared his throat, louder this time. He adjusted his glasses and looked to Reed. "Counsel, were you aware of this material?" Reed stood slowly. "No, Your Honor. We were told all evidence had been disclosed in discovery. This was not part of our file." But his voice cracked on the last word. It didn't matter anymore what he said. The court wasn't looking at him. They were looking at Jasmine Crockett, and for the first time that morning, not with judgment, but with doubt in themselves. Because the story they'd all accepted, that she had deceived donors, fabricated numbers, gamed the system, was beginning to collapse. And not from emotion, not from speeches, but from ink and timestamps and the unmistakable scent of a cover-up gone brittle. Page 3 wasn't even necessary. The damage had already started to bleed. The prosecution's case had gone from airtight to unraveling. And Malcolm Reed, the confident hunter from earlier, now looked like a man slowly realizing the trap was under his own feet all along. But Jasmine, still silent, still poised. Because when you know the truth is loaded in the chamber, there's no need to pull the trigger fast. You just have to aim it at the right time. And this, right now, was the moment the truth finally showed its teeth. Judge Clarence Thomas leaned forward, the tips of his fingers resting lightly on the pages, as if the paper might slice open his skin. He wasn't reading now. He was absorbing. Line after line, phrase after phrase, the architecture of an entire prosecution began to buckle beneath the weight of what hadn't been said, what had been buried. His eyes darted across official seals, digital timestamps, full names, initials, instructions masked as suggestions, delays framed as discretion. Every document was clean, legible, procedural, and each one dripped with betrayal. He tried to maintain composure, but Jasmine saw it, the faint tremor in his left hand as he turned the fourth page, the way he adjusted his glasses twice in 20 seconds, the pause before he exhaled. It wasn't confusion. It was realization. And it wasn't about her anymore. Because in that moment, what lay before him wasn't just a collection of exhibits. It was a mirror. One that reflected a far more damning truth than any courtroom had been prepared to confront. The crime was never hers. It was theirs. The Department of Justice, an institution sworn to fairness, had knowingly withheld exculpatory evidence, manipulated public perception, and attempted to crush a woman not because she lied, but because she refused to kneel. What he was holding was more than evidence. It was the anatomy of a cover-up, dissected under oath. Around him, the room had fallen silent, not the expectant silence of drama, but the heavy, shamed silence of recognition. Cameras no longer fixated on Jasmine like prey. Reporters no longer scribbled salacious takes. Even Malcolm Reed's chair, once occupied with confidence, now sat stiff and isolated, as if the man inside it were shrinking with every page turn. Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't lean forward. She didn't move. Her face was as unreadable as it had been since the moment she walked in, but something subtle shifted in her posture. It was hard to define. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper, quieter, relief without release. Because for the first time since this ordeal began, the weight she carried didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a message. This wasn't her trial anymore. Not truly. It was the system's, and she was no longer the one under the judge's microscope. Now the system was the one being examined, cross-examined, and judged, not by opinion, but by its own paperwork, its own decisions, its own digital footprints. Judge Thomas looked up. For the first time that morning, his gaze did not rest on the defendant. It searched the room. It searched Reed. It searched the corner where the DOJ observers sat stony-faced, trying not to shift. And then slowly it returned to the folder, now opened wide on the bench like a wound no robe could cover. He set his hand over it, not to close it, but to steady himself. Because what he now understood couldn't be unread. And Jasmine, she never broke. She just waited for the truth to speak louder than she ever needed to. Malcolm Reed shifted in his chair, But the room didn't shift with him. The walls didn't bend to his confidence like they had in other courtrooms. His voice didn't carry the authority it used to. He was no longer the man at the helm. He was just a man, surrounded by silence, drowning in evidence he hadn't seen coming. His fingers fumbled over the edge of a binder. He tried to speak, but only static came out. Half words, broken confidence. A single page slipped from his folder and skittered across the table. Another followed. He reached to stop them, but his elbow struck the microphone base, knocking it sideways. In the rush to recover, his temple clipped the sharp edge of the wood, the dull thud echoing louder than anything he'd said all morning. It wasn't dramatic. It was awkward. It was humiliating. Gasps rippled through the gallery like slow motion, the kind of moment people weren't sure whether to look away or lean in. "I've got this," he muttered under his breath, voice cracking, trying to summon the version of himself he remembered. Cool, sharp, untouchable. But the words came out too fast, too thin, and worse. They were meant for him, not the court. It was a whispered plea to a crumbling ego, a prayer with no congregation. Judge Thomas said nothing. He didn't have to. The camera lenses didn't blink. Every one of them now pointed at the man once considered the prosecution's prize fighter, watching him fold, one clumsy motion at a time. And across from him sat Illa Hartman. Still, steady. She didn't smirk. She didn't savor it. She simply adjusted her glasses with one hand and folded her other over her briefcase like a quiet guardian of balance. If justice had a face in that room, it wasn't on the bench or behind the prosecution table. It was hers. Calm, centered, ready. A whisper snuck through the room from the back row. "He's losing it," another answered. "He already has." Malcolm gathered his papers with frantic energy, the kind that couldn't be hidden anymore. His hands trembled. One sheet fluttered from his grip to the floor, and he reached for it, too fast, knocking another stack loose. The court stenographer paused, unsure whether to record the moment or the silence that swallowed it. And Jasmine? Still seated, still composed. Her expression hadn't changed since the day began, but her eyes, sharp and deliberate, never left him. Not in triumph, not in revenge, in recognition. She had seen men like Malcolm before, armed with charm and institutional weight, believing the system would always tilt in their favor. But now the weight was on his shoulders, and the system wasn't shielding him, because predators look different when the lights come on. And the hunter today was the one stumbling, bleeding, exposed, not from bullets or arguments, but from truth. And truth, when it arrives late, doesn't knock politely. It rips the roof off the courthouse and waits for no one to recover. Judge Clarence Thomas sat still for what felt like an eternity, though the clock above the bench marked only minutes. The folder remained open before him, its pages like open wounds bleeding into the wood grain of the bench. His right hand rested on top of it, not to protect it, just to feel something solid. He looked older now, not in years, but in weight, like the words he was about to speak had been waiting for decades and had finally found the breath to leave his chest. He removed his glasses, folded them once, set them carefully beside the folder, and let out a single breath. Then in a tone that could have been mistaken for a prayer, he spoke. "Upon review of the evidence submitted by the defense," he began, his voice low but unwavering, "this court confirms that critical exculpatory materials were willfully withheld by the Department of Justice." A pause, not for drama, but to let the truth settle. The room, which had been crackling with whispers and anticipation only moments before, now folded inward. Not silent, reverent. Judge Thomas continued, each word carved from granite. "This concealment constitutes a severe violation of federal transparency law and due process. It did not simply deny the defendant her rights. It stained the credibility of this court, of this institution, and of the very meaning of justice." His words weren't an opinion. They were an autopsy. He leaned forward now, voice sharpened by something far deeper than anger. Grief. Therefore, the civil penalty of $500 million levied against Representative Jasmine Crockett is hereby vacated, effective immediately. He struck the gavel once. Not thunderous, just final. There was no gasp, No cheer, no eruption of applause. The moment didn't ask for celebration, it commanded stillness, as if the air had thickened, pulled all movement to a halt. The reporters lowered their pens. The court artists stopped sketching mid-stroke. Even the cameras felt hesitant to click. Something sacred had just occurred, not in ritual, but in reckoning. Malcolm Reed sat motionless, staring at the bench like he couldn't hear what had been said, or wished he hadn't. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett closed her eyes. Not in relief, not in triumph, but with the quiet exhale of someone who had carried too much weight for too long and was now finally putting it down. Not forever. Just enough to stand tall again. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. Because she understood something most people never grasp. Justice doesn't always shout when it arrives. Sometimes it whispers like a funeral bell. Not for the innocent, but for the lie that finally died. And in that silence, a new question began to rise. Not about the verdict, but about everything that came next. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. The real work had just begun. He didn't speak again. Judge Clarence Thomas simply looked up, and for the first time all morning, his gaze found hers not as a symbol of law, not as the weight of the bench, but as a man who had just seen something he couldn't unsee. Their eyes met across the stillness, and for a long moment, neither moved. In that silence, stripped of titles, stripped of robes, stripped of accusation and defense, they stood not as judge and defendant, but as two people facing the same broken mirror. Jasmine didn't blink. Her chin was steady, her breath quiet, her presence still carved from calm. But something passed between them in that unspoken stare. Something beyond power, beyond guilt, beyond law. It was recognition that the damage wasn't just what had been done to her. It was what had been allowed to exist, unquestioned, for so long. And now, under the hot lights of a courtroom meant to crucify her, it had finally cracked open. The wood of the bench, the marble of the floor, the velvet drapes behind the seal, all of it seemed suddenly cosmetic, like paint on a rusted structure. For a second, Judge Thomas's hand twitched, as if he might reach for something to hold on to. But there was nothing. Just papers, a folder, and truth laid bare between them. The gallery didn't dare shift. The silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was sacred, as if everyone inside had become witness not to a verdict, but to a confession neither party had spoken aloud. That what had happened here was not a detour in the road of justice. It was the map itself, burned at the edges, revealing trails no one wanted to admit existed. A voiceover enters, not loud, not dramatic, just woven into the stillness, because this wasn't a victory speech. This wasn't a rally cry. It was a redefinition, a repurposing of what it meant to win, not by destroying others, but by revealing the structures that destroy quietly, slowly, daily. She let the stillness hang for a beat, then leaned in just slightly. "I'm not standing here as a victim, or even just a survivor," she said. "I'm standing here as proof. Proof that when left unchecked, our justice system isn't broken. It's been hijacked, not by accident, by design." Gasps didn't ripple, but backs straightened. Pens pressed harder into notepads. The room, once full of professionals used to carefully frame sound bites, now listened with the attention usually reserved for last words or oaths. And still, no slogans, still, no applause. Just her. One woman once buried under lies, now unearthing them publicly, not with venom, but with clarity, not with vengeance, but with vision. Behind her, the flag didn't wave. The air conditioner rattled faintly. The lights buzzed overhead. But in the still center of it all was Jasmine Crockett. No longer someone defending her innocence, but someone redefining what justice was supposed to mean in the first place. And she wasn't done, not even close. She let the silence sit, steady and heavy, like fresh soil on a grave. The nation was still bearing the illusion that its justice system functioned the same for everyone. And now Jasmine was ready to do more than mourn that truth. She was ready to rebuild it. Her hands rested on the podium, her fingers splayed flat as if anchoring herself not to the wood but to the moment. There are those who will say this was a one-time failure, she began. A glitch, a misstep, a mistake. She shook her head once. Number, this was a structure working exactly as it was designed to bury, to delay, to protect itself, not the people. So I'm not here just to survive it. I'm here to change it. She looked out across the room, eyes steady, scanning the faces of journalists, policy staffers, and silent watchers who had come expecting a press conference and now found themselves inside a reckoning. Starting today, she said, I will be introducing 3 reforms to Congress. Not suggestions, not symbolic gestures. Reforms with teeth. She held up one finger. First, mandatory evidence disclosure laws. If the government is in possession of evidence that proves someone's innocence, they cannot sit on it. Not for convenience, not for political strategy, not for optics. If it proves innocence, it must be submitted. No exceptions, no delays, no discretion. A few heads nodded. Some began scribbling. Others simply stared. She held up a second finger. Second, real whistleblower protections. Not polite language on internal memos. Not we support you in theory. I mean statutory protection. Federal law. Whistleblowers need teeth. The kind that bite back when you're threatened for doing the right thing. The silence deepened. No one interrupted. No one dared. And third, she said, raising her last finger, a bipartisan judicial oversight council. If a judge ignores material evidence, like mine did, or a prosecutor withholds the truth to win headlines, they must be held accountable, not behind closed doors, not in career-friendly committees, but publicly, transparently, with consequences. She paused. I don't say this as someone who read it in a textbook, she continued, voice low but unwavering. I say this as someone who had to sit in court knowing the truth existed, and that those in power chose to bury it instead of reveal it. She leaned forward. If it can happen to a sitting congresswoman, with lawyers, with a mic, with cameras in the room, ask yourself, what chance does a warehouse worker in Detroit have? A school teacher in Georgia? A veteran in Ohio? No one answered. They didn't need to, because the answer was already written in every name that never made the news, in every file that never left the drawer, in every courtroom that stayed silent a moment too long. And Jasmine was done with silence. Now it was time for structure. She let the last sentence hang in the air like smoke after a shot. There were no theatrics, no dramatic lean-ins, no rehearsed pauses, just her voice, simple and final. If it proves innocence, it must be submitted. No exceptions. Then, nothing. Not the awkward silence of a room unsure how to respond. Not the breathless pause waiting for applause. It was something else entirely. It was stillness. A kind of stillness that presses into the chest. That makes people straighten without realizing. That forces everyone, cynics, allies, even critics, to stop looking at the woman and start looking at the wound she just reopened in front of them. Jasmine stood still, not as a performer awaiting ovation, but as someone who had just poured something unfiltered into a room trained to filter everything. Her hands dropped from the podium. She didn't blink fast to hold back tears. She didn't shift her weight for effect. She simply stood in the weight of her own truth. Then, somewhere near the back, a single clap. Software hesitant, but not unsure. Then another, louder, closer, and then, without prompting, without stage direction, without even eye contact to coordinate it, the room rose. Not for Jasmine Crockett, not really. They rose for what she stood for the evidence that had spoken louder than any closing argument, for the principle that had withstood the machine, for the idea so old it felt forgotten that justice could still mean something beyond politics, beyond power, beyond perception. Reporters dropped their pens. Notebooks fell shut. Aides stopped typing. Cameramen shifted lenses from wide to close up, not because they were told to, but because they didn't want to miss what dignity looked like in real time. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just looked up, at no one in particular, and said quietly, almost like a benediction, justice shouldn't depend on your volume or your wallet, only on the truth. Then she stepped away from the podium. No music played, no chants followed. The only sound was the sustained applause of people who had not clapped for a politician, but for the return of something they feared had died long ago: integrity in public space. One man near the press wall mouthed the words to a colleague, "She didn't just speak, she reset the room." And it was true. In a world obsessed with going viral, Jasmine Crockett had done something far more rare. She had gone honest. And honesty, when delivered without demand for praise, carries more power than any headline. As she disappeared through the side door, still alone, still quiet, the cameras didn't follow. They didn't need to, because the echo she left behind wasn't visual. It was ethical. It wasn't meant for the public. The video wasn't edited, captioned, or leaked to the press in a manila envelope. It appeared one night on a low-traffic, government-focused video archive site, buried beneath spreadsheets, budget PDFs, and outdated hearing transcripts. Just a quiet, unassuming file labeled DOJ Internal Debrief Confidential.mp4. No fanfare, no watermark, no warning. But what it contained would tear the illusion of institutional integrity down to its studs. The video opened on a grainy Zoom grid: 10 Department of Justice officials, some high-level attorneys, others senior policy advisors. Their faces were evenly lit by screen glow, tired but relaxed, casual in the way people are when they think they've already won. Chatter filled the audio: budget lines, post-verdict messaging, a few jokes about media spin. And then one man leaned forward. He wore a gray DOJ hoodie, not a suit. His mug read, "World's Okayest Prosecutor." And with a sip of coffee, he said it. "We had to bring her down. If we don't control the narrative, she's unstoppable by midterms." No one flinched. Someone off to the side laughed softly. Another voice added, "Yeah. Once she gets rolling, the press laps it up. Optics were always going to be the threat, not the facts." A woman's voice chimed in next. "Honestly, if this leaks, it's our careers, but the penalty already hit. Let the dust settle." Then, silence. 5 seconds. No one moved. The screen held its frame like a machine holding its breath, just long enough for the horror of what had been said to land. And then it happened. "Wait, are we still recording?" The voice cut through like a snapped violin string. There was a flicker of motion, someone reaching off screen, and then cut to black. No timestamp, no fade, no credits, just gone. But the world didn't look away. By sunrise, the clip had migrated across Reddit threads, watchdog forums, and journalist Slack channels. By noon, it was viral. By the 48-hour mark, 18 million views. Cable anchors called it the most damning modern confirmation of institutional targeting ever caught on tape. Legal analysts didn't even try to explain it away. "There's no interpretation needed," one said flatly. They admitted what everyone feared. She wasn't prosecuted, she was silenced. Jasmine Crockett said nothing. No press release, no tweet, no comment. She didn't have to. For once, the machine that had tried to erase her had spoken louder than any speech she could give. And those 5 seconds of silence, those precious, irreversible seconds before the screen cut to black, became the country's new litmus test. Some saw it as proof, others as betrayal, but no one dismissed it. Because in that silence, we didn't just hear them. We heard ourselves, finally realizing what we'd allowed to happen. The hearings were called before the ink was dry on the headlines. No preamble, no bipartisan stalling. Just an emergency session hastily scheduled at 8 a.m. Every chair filled before the gavel dropped. The House Oversight Committee, usually a stage for political theater, suddenly felt more like a tribunal. No grandstanding, no smirking. Just silence, and a list of names read aloud like a roll call for judgment. By the end of that day, 3 senior DOJ officials had been placed on administrative leave. 2 more quietly resigned overnight. Internal memos leaked within hours showed frantic back-channel emails, damage control meetings, legal advisories, HR scrambling to assess optics. But the optics were already shattered. You couldn't spin a line like, "We had to bring her down." That wasn't a soundbite. It was a verdict. Outside, the press called it the week Washington blinked. The Inspector General's office, long known for its procedural pacing and reluctance to rattle the cage, did something it hadn't done in over a decade. It announced a full criminal investigation into the DOJ's handling of the Crockett prosecution. Not a review, not a panel, a criminal inquiry, with subpoena power, with testimony under oath, with televised hearings that would pull back the curtain most thought welded shut. Subcommittees began drafting legislation within days. Journalists raced to find more digital threads. Civil rights attorneys who had once fought alone began pooling resources. Across the country, in barbershops and boardrooms, the question echoed, if they could do it to her, how many others never got the camera? But in the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't appear before Congress, even though several members begged her to testify. She didn't give interviews, despite requests from every major network. Her spokesperson simply said, "The Congresswoman is focused on legislation and letting the truth speak louder than headlines." And it did. Because while the DOJ staggered, while officials once considered untouchable fumbled for legal counsel and cover stories, Jasmine's silence became the loudest sound in America. She went to work like any other day, attended committee meetings, listened more than she spoke, reviewed language on the Equal Justice Disclosure Act. No fanfare, no victory lap, just the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knows the mountain isn't finished falling just because the avalanche has begun. And the brilliance of her restraint, it told the country what no tweet ever could, that she hadn't been fighting for applause. She'd been fighting for accountability. And now that it had arrived, shaking the very floorboards of the institutions that once tried to bury her, she didn't need to shout, because the system was already echoing with her silence. The invitation had been sent months earlier, back when Jasmine Crockett was just another name on a committee, and Judge Clarence Thomas was still viewed by most as a quiet monolith on the Supreme Court. The keynote address at Georgetown Law's annual symposium was meant to be ceremonial, uneventful, like so many that came before it. No one expected it to become a turning point, not even him. The auditorium was packed. Students, professors, federal clerks, former justices, every seat filled before the doors closed. The podium was polished, the lighting warm but firm. As Thomas approached the stage, the audience hushed instinctively. They didn't expect fireworks. They expected formality, the kind that came with age, with robes, with legacy. But what they got was something else. He stood still for a long moment. Then he set aside his notes. "Law," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably altered, "is not meant to be a shield for the powerful." A breath passed through the crowd like a tremor. It is not a tool of silence, or delay, or fear. He paused. The room didn't move. Even the air seemed still, like the walls were afraid to echo without permission. "For decades," he continued, "I have stood behind rulings, behind precedent, behind the idea that order must prevail over chaos. That stability is the highest virtue in a republic. But what I saw, what we all saw, was not stability. It was theater, a performance meant to protect power, not truth." He reached into his coat pocket, removed his glasses, and set them gently on the podium. Then, with one trembling hand, he wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. Not with drama, but with something heavier than pride: recognition. "I don't stand here today to defend the bench," he said softly. "I stand because the bench can no longer defend itself, not from what it allowed." And then he looked out over the sea of students, lawyers, lawmakers, future judges. "You will inherit this system, and what you inherit will be cracked, not broken beyond repair, but cracked. And every choice you make from this moment forward will either deepen those fractures or begin to mend them." He stepped back. No applause came instantly. There was too much weight in the room. Then slowly, one by one, people began to stand. Not in deference to a title, not for a judge, but for a man who chose to say what others had swallowed for decades. The next morning, his words were printed in every major newspaper. Law schools across the country assigned the speech as required reading. Ethics panels opened discussions that hadn't been touched in years. And for the first time in a long time, the system didn't pretend it had redeemed itself. Because it hadn't. It had been forced to, by truth. And by one man, too late for comfort, but finally in time. There were no confetti cannons, no book deals announced, no televised victory laps in tailored suits across the Sunday morning political circuit. Jasmine Crockett disappeared from headlines as quickly as she had entered them, but not because the story ended, because she chose where the next chapter would be written. She didn't go on The View. She turned down 60 Minutes. Even the New York Times had to settle for no comment. Her staff received dozens of requests a day. We'd love her for a feature. Just 10 minutes on camera. An exclusive for the anniversary of the verdict. The answer was always the same. She's not available. But that didn't mean she was hiding. Jasmine Crockett was in veterans clinics, listening to men whose benefits had been caught in red tape for years longer than she'd been in Congress. She was in church basements, where chairs didn't match and microphones squealed, but truth flowed freely, raw and without spin. She was in inner city schools, not behind podiums, but at folding tables, talking to teachers about breakfast programs and students about broken air conditioners. No press followed, no statements were issued. If you didn't know better, you might think she was just another volunteer who dressed too sharply and stayed too long after the meeting ended. She doesn't preach change, one pastor in Southeast D.C. said quietly. She listens to it. In a country where the powerful often need to be reminded what broken feels like, Jasmine never forgot. She didn't need to perform humility. She wore it like a second skin. There was no separation between the woman who stood in front of the Supreme Court and the one sitting on plastic chairs beside janitors in city gymnasiums. She took no selfies. She signed no posters. But what she gave was presence. In a community center on Chicago's South Side, a group of teenage girls waited for her like she was a celebrity. When she arrived, they didn't mob her. They stared. Quiet, unsure if someone they'd only seen on viral clips could really just walk in and sit beside them. She did, and she asked their names first. Not what they wanted to be someday, but what they loved right now. Article Science. A boy who made them laugh. A grandmother who told better stories than TikTok ever could. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't come back to be celebrated. She came back to stay connected to the people she never stopped fighting for. Long before the world watched her speak in courtrooms, and long after it would forget what had been said. No tour, no parade, just the road beneath her feet and the voices that kept her grounded. The real ones, the quiet ones, the ones justice too often forgets. The clinic wasn't large. It didn't smell like a hospital, more like dust and Lysol, with a faint trace of burnt coffee lingering from a decades-old machine in the break room. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the vinyl chairs in the waiting area creaked under the weight of years, not people. It was the kind of place few politicians visited, unless it was an election year or a scheduled photo op. Jasmine Crockett came on a Tuesday, unannounced, alone. She met with nurses first, women who worked double shifts with half the staff and none of the funding. Then came the veterans, men who had worn uniforms long before hashtags existed, now fighting battles with paperwork instead of weapons. Jasmine sat in a folding chair, listening more than talking, taking notes not for show but for follow-through. And then came her. She was small, maybe 5 feet even, wrapped in a shawl worn thin at the edges. Her fingers curled around the handle of her purse like she was bracing for bad news. No one asked her to speak. She simply stood up from her seat in the corner, shuffled toward Jasmine, and paused. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room. I stopped believing in government a long time ago. The words hung there, not angry, not accusatory, just true. A truth that had lived in her bones through generations of broken promises, unfixed systems, and leaders who smiled for cameras but turned their backs on the real world. She looked Jasmine in the eyes, her hands trembling slightly, and said, "But after what you did, I believe in you." There was no applause, no gasps, just a stillness that wrapped itself around Jasmine's chest like a ribbon being pulled tight. She blinked once hard, not because she was trying to hold back emotion, because the weight of that sentence, it wasn't praise, it was responsibility. And that responsibility felt heavier than any verdict she had ever stood through in a courtroom. She reached out, gently held the woman's hand, and nodded. Not to say thank you, to say, I hear you, I carry this now. Later, her staff would try to ask what had happened in that moment. why she'd gone so quiet, why she stayed seated long after the woman had left. She didn't answer at first, but before they moved to the next location, she spoke just above a whisper. The courtroom was only the prologue. That sentence, that woman, that's the story. And it was. Because the real fight was never about overturning fines or exposing corruption. It was about restoring a voice to someone who hadn't used hers in decades because no one had listened until now. The vote was called at 10:41 a.m. On the House floor, cameras captured history in real time. Screens lit up across the country with a headline that, just a year ago, would have seemed improbable. Congress passes Equal Justice Disclosure Act. The final tally was stronger than expected, bipartisan, decisive, undeniable. The gallery clapped, some lawmakers rose, others offered handshakes across aisles not often crossed. On paper, it was a legislative victory. In reality, it was something more. The bill had been born in the shadow of scandal, drafted in haste but forged with care. It mandated the immediate release of exculpatory evidence in all federal cases. It codified real protections for whistleblowers. It created a permanent, independent oversight council with authority to investigate judges and prosecutors alike, regardless of party, position, or tenure. The name at the top of the bill was simple: Crockett, Waters, Henderson, Equal Justice Disclosure Act. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't there when the gavel fell. She wasn't on the House floor to give a statement. She didn't stand with her co-sponsors for the ceremonial photo. Her seat was empty. Instead, she was 6 miles away, in the cafeteria of a public elementary school, standing beside a janitor who had just finished mopping the hallway. They talked about his son, how he couldn't afford a lawyer last year, and almost lost custody of his daughter over a false accusation. Jasmine nodded, asked for the county clerk's name, and promised to follow up. 20 minutes later, she was in the lobby of a nursing home, arms wrapped around a woman who'd been watching the vote on a tiny TV with static across the screen. "That's you," the woman whispered, pointing to the vote count. Jasmine only smiled and replied, "That's us." Back in the Capitol, her colleagues fielded questions, gave quotes, stood before a line of microphones, and every time her name came up, the same question followed: "Where is she?" The answer didn't need to be explained, because anyone who had been watching Jasmine Crockett from the beginning already knew. She didn't fight for the podium. She fought for the people far from it. While others were framing narratives, she was listening to the janitors who clean the buildings where those narratives are written. While others updated websites with accomplishments, she was hugging grandmothers who had outlived justice for decades. The Equal Justice Disclosure Act would change lives. But for Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't a trophy. It was a tool placed back into the hands of people who'd long been told they didn't have a voice, or worse, that they didn't deserve one. And if you asked her why she wasn't in the chamber when the law passed, she'd probably just say, "Because justice doesn't need a stage. It needs a heartbeat." The chamber was at full capacity. Congressional aides lined the walls, journalists perched at the back, tablets ready. The gallery was filled with students, veterans, clergy, union workers, survivors of wrongful convictions, each one invited by name. The occasion was historic: the passage of the Equal Justice Disclosure Act, and the woman who had become its quiet architect was about to deliver the closing address. C-SPAN was live. Every camera pointed forward. The room was still, taut with anticipation. Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the floor, her blue suit pressed but not flashy, hair pulled back, folder in hand. She walked with quiet purpose toward the podium until her left foot caught the undone loop of her shoelace. There was no time to catch herself. She stumbled, hard, and slammed squarely into the wooden podium. A gasp shot across the room. Her folder exploded open, papers flying in all directions like startled birds. A senator stood instinctively. An aide moved toward her. For a moment it was chaos, but a silent kind, a frozen kind. The kind that happens when an entire nation, watching live, holds its breath. And then from the floor, a laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, not a defensive laugh, a real one. Jasmine sat up, brushed hair from her face, shook her head and laughed, shoulders trembling not from embarrassment, but from the absurdity of it all. Her smile reached her eyes as she grabbed the microphone cable, pulled herself up with both hands, and looked across the room with mock gravity. "Well," she said, voice clear and steady, "if anyone needed proof, I didn't come here to impress you." A few chuckles. "Let's get to work." Applause erupted. Not the polite kind, not the obligated kind. The kind that bursts forth because something real has just happened, and the entire room recognizes it. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She wasn't just a survivor of institutional targeting or the author of sweeping legal reform. She was human. And in being human, imperfect, unguarded, resilient, she reminded everyone watching that justice isn't an abstract. It's messy. It stumbles. It gets back up. She gathered her papers slowly, aides offering them back with quiet awe. But she didn't rush. She let the moment breathe. Then she took her place at the podium, shoelace still untied, and began. "I've spoken in courtrooms. I've spoken in hearings. But today I don't come to speak for myself. I come to speak for those who never got the mic." And just like that, the fall became the foundation. What began as a stumble became the most honest beginning a speech could ask for. Because sometimes the strongest thing a leader can do isn't stand tall, it's stand up. Again. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, shoelace now retied, hair slightly tousled from the fall, but posture straight, eyes calm. There was no roaring passion in her tone, no pounding fists, no demands for vindication. Instead, her voice moved like water, measured, precise, and impossibly steady. "People think justice comes loud," she began. "They think it comes with chants, with marches, with headlines. And sometimes it does." A pause, no one stirred. "But other times it comes slowly, through paperwork, through whispers, through one woman walking into a courtroom carrying nothing but a folder and refusing to sit down when they tell her to." This wasn't a speech to inspire applause. It was a mirror held to the nation. "I didn't fight with rage," she continued. "I fought with evidence, with patience, with the kind of stubborn faith that keeps you upright even when the entire system is designed to grind you down." The room hung on every word. Because Jasmine wasn't trying to be powerful. She already was. Not because she had the floor, but because she had always shown up, day after day, hearing after hearing, injustice after injustice, with no armor but truth. She talked about laws that should have been passed decades ago, about names that never made it into the news cycle, about the mother who worked 3 jobs and never had a lawyer worth more than $800 a month, about the teenager who pled guilty not because he was, but because innocence is a luxury when bail costs more than rent. But she didn't tell these stories to shame the room. She told them to remind it. "You don't need a grand stage," she said, eyes sweeping across the chamber. "You just need one truth, and the courage to stand with it." There it was, simple, unshakable. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't performing. She was practicing what she had always preached, that consistency, not charisma, changes the world. That justice isn't a firework, it's a flame, and it needs people willing to tend it long after the cameras leave. She told the room that her story was not exceptional, that it was visible only because so many others like hers had been silenced, that her fight was not the climax, but the consequence of all the times the system failed to listen. And now, finally, it was listening. Not because she shouted, but because she never stopped speaking. And because when the truth is consistent enough, it doesn't need volume to echo. It just needs someone to carry it without flinching. The chamber lights dimmed. The speech was over. But the story wasn't. Somewhere in the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's final words, something lingered. Not applause, not triumph, but recognition. That what had just unfolded wasn't the conclusion of a personal fight. It was the quiet ignition of a public promise. Never underestimate a single person who refuses to bow to injustice. The voiceover came softly, woven into a montage that didn't scream. It breathed. Jasmine at a lunch table, talking with a cafeteria worker about the cost of insulin. A clip of her walking, alone, through a government building long after others had left. A child handing her a drawing labeled, "My mom says you're real." Then the folder. That same yellowed folder, creases sharp, corners frayed, paper held together by resolve more than staples, now encased behind glass in the Library of Congress. No ceremony, just a plaque that read, Exhibit DOJV, Crockett. Truth submitted under oath. Cut to another image, not a courtroom, but a community garden. Jasmine kneeling beside a retired schoolteacher, both in sweatshirts, planting something that looked like tomatoes. No microphones, no press. Just two hands in the soil, rebuilding trust where policy had failed. Another frame, a classroom wall in Detroit. On it, a printout of her quote, "You don't need a grand stage, just one truth and the courage to stand with it." The camera pans slowly across rows of desks, one of them empty, with a notebook still open and the words underlined 3 times. Fade to a black and white image of court transcripts, crossed out lines, hand-marked margins, timestamps circled in red. Not as evidence, but as a reminder of how close injustice can get to becoming permanent record until someone interrupts it. And then, Jasmine walking alone in the early morning light down a quiet street in Dallas. Coffee in hand, briefcase under one arm, no entourage in sight. A normal day, a new day. The voiceover returned, gentler now as if speaking from the future. She didn't just win, a pause. She rewrote what justice could look like. The screen faded not to black, but to warm gray. No crescendo music, just the sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, continuing forward. Because in the end, Jasmine Crockett's greatest legacy wasn't that she survived the fire. It was that she made space for others to step into the light without fear. And perhaps that's the deepest kind of justice. Not what we win for ourselves, but what we leave behind so others don't have to fight the same battles alone. A single folder, a single fall, a single woman who didn't bow, and a nation that, because of her, finally began to rise. And so the story does not end. It passes, like a lit torch, into the hands of those still walking. What Jasmine Crockett proved, not through speeches or titles but through quiet resolve, is that integrity has a longer life than power, and truth, when carried patiently, cuts through the noise like morning light through mist. In every broken system, there lies the seed of renewal, but it does not grow through outrage alone. It grows through those who stay when the cameras turn away, those who read the fine print, those who whisper, "Not on my watch," and then live as though that whisper were law. This film is not intended as legal advice, political instruction, or partisan judgment. It is a story grounded in courage, built on record, and offered in the hope that it might remind us all. Silence is not always surrender, and resistance is not always loud. Sometimes justice enters quietly, but when it stands tall, like she did, it changes everything. Because a single honest voice can shake the walls of an empire built on lies. Thank you for staying till the end. Your time, your heart, your presence matters more than you know. If this story spoke to you, speak back. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let's keep this conversation and this fight alive.